Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about New York's new retail workplace violence prevention law. My name is Melanie Naranjo. I head up the people team here at Ethena, and I am joined by the lovely Brandis Anderson, who is our general counsel at Ethena. We'll do more formal intros in a second, but wanted to sort of give a high-level overview of why we're here today, what support we aim to provide, and then really welcome you and invite you to ask whatever questions you have in the comments. We do like to make these interactive and make sure that you're getting high value out of these calls. So with that said, today we're going to be chatting, as I mentioned, about New York's retail workplace violence prevention law, which I imagine for some people is catching people by surprise. For other people, you've been paying attention the whole time and you're trying to get into the weeds of it. And so that's what we'll do today. Brandis, I'll let you give a brief intro about yourself, and then I'll tell a little bit more about me, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Yep, great. Welcome, everybody. I'm Brandis. As Melanie mentioned, I'm a general counsel here at Ethena. I've been here for over 3 years. I previously was at a fintech company, Plaid, for several years, and before that, I was an enforcement attorney with the federal government. I'm excited to talk today about New York's new Retail Workers Safety Act, and so thank you all for signing in.
Lovely. And as I mentioned, I head up the people team here. And one of the things I love about working at a compliance training company is that Brandis keeps me super up to date on all the latest compliance needs, whether it applies to us or not, because we want to make sure that we're providing the right info to you. And being a compliance provider, we really do like to make sure that we are, as always, super up to date, providing resources, whether you're an existing customer, someone who's considering, or just someone who generally likes to be up to date on compliance laws. That's what we're here for. So with that said, quick overview on a couple things that we'll be chatting through, and I'll make this a little bigger for everyone. We're going to be breaking down this new law. Who does it apply to? What are the deadlines that you need to be paying attention to? And what are the key requirements? We'll try and keep this brief and short, to the point where Brandis and I were chatting. We were like, listen, if we end this webinar in 30 minutes and people get the info they need and they can have an extra 30 minutes in their day, that's what we're going to do, okay? We're also going to talk about how you build up a good policy to make sure that it's covering all the needs that you have, so that you're paying attention to risk factors, mitigating appropriately, and still balancing your cultural and business needs. Nobody has time to, put 3 teams on this and spend 300 hours making it all work. So we're going to provide you with as many resources as possible to keep this low lift and compliant. We'll talk about some training best practices, including trainings that Ethena offers that can help you meet your needs. Again, the less thinking and work that you have to do, the better, so you can just get up and running and get compliant. And we'll do a quick Ethena spotlight and then open it up to Q&A for any questions that anybody has. As always, we like to provide a quick disclaimer that Brandis is our lawyer, not your lawyer, which means that anything that Brandis shares on this call should not be seen as legal advice. It's for informational purposes only. You should absolutely always consult your own lawyer if you have very specific in-the-weeds questions, because context is key. Brandis, anything that you want to add here as our resident lawyer before we jump into it?
Nope, I think you covered it.
Okay, lovely. All right, so with that said, I'm going to kick it off with a little interactional pulse check. In the comments, please don't leave me hanging. On a scale of 1 to 5, how prepared do you currently feel to meet the requirements of this new law? 5 being, I'm an expert, everything's in place, we've already got our training and policy done. 1 being, I didn't even know that this was a new law until Ethena reached out about this. In the comments, 1 to 5, I will pause for a second. Okay, so we're seeing a good mixed bag. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to introduce your company or anything like that, but I am going to call on a couple of people. Look at that, Whitney knows. Whitney's been to these webinars before. If you put an asterisk next to your response, I don't call on you. All right, let's call on Lori Parker. Can you unmute yourself and tell me a little bit more? And there's no shame in this. I will tell you, I didn't know this was coming up till Branda's put this on my radar. When did you hear about this, and what are you thinking about right now?
I thank you for this webinar. I'm just thinking because I, as an HR professional, want to make sure that I am up to date on compliance. I had worked in retail, so it's always really interesting. And when I saw this webinar, I was really interested in finding out more.
Oh, good. Love to hear that. Okay, thank you, Lori. I'll call on one other person. Let's see if we can find someone on the other end. Sandra Gomez, you gave a 4. Tell me a little bit more. How do you feel so prepared? How are you an expert already?
I'm not an expert, but I follow Ethena very closely to the emails that come out, and also I get a few emails that from different places that what's coming on and what's up to date. So just trying to keep up to date with the laws that come out to be in compliance.
Good, love that. And Sandra, can I ask you a quick follow-up question? Are there any things in particular that you're hoping to get out of today's webinar, or are there any areas that you're concerned could cause some friction, whether it be getting up and running with a training or putting together a policy that meets all the needs? Like, what's top of mind for you?
So both, if we need to put in together a training, deadlines, and also if we need to include it in the policies that we do it so as well.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Sandra. Really appreciate you all participating here. It makes me feel less like I'm talking to myself. I promise you that we will be giving you all that stuff today. So you will walk away feeling everybody at a 5. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing for a second so that it can just feel a little bit more intimate. You can see my and Brandis's faces. So Brandis, for those of us in the room who are on the ones or closer to 1 on this spectrum here, what exactly is this new law? What are the requirements? What does it mean?
Yeah, sure. And feel free to interrupt. I can get too into the weeds sometimes of the law, so feel free to interrupt if I'm going in too deeply. But essentially in September of 2024, the governor of New York signed the Retail Worker Safety Act into law. It requires covered employers to take certain actions aimed at preventing workplace violence. And it was really intended to increase retail worker safety. Just like a couple of statistics, like retail violence is really a growing concern in the US. I think 80% of retail workers fear an active shooter scenario. 2/3 have experienced verbal harassment or intimidation at work. Less than 10% felt their employer made safety improvements after violent incidents. And so this is like something that's becoming more of an issue. And so the New York governor really decided to take action to sign in place a law really targeting the increase in violence directed at retail workers. So a lot of people are probably sitting here like wondering, does this apply to me? So before I get into some of the requirements, let me just like explain who this applies to. So it applies to covered employers, which is like any person, business, entity, company that has at least 10 retail employees in New York. And so retail employees are employees working in a retail store. So think a store that sells consumer commodities and not a store that sells food for consumption on the premises. So it's very clear that this is like retail employees working in a retail store. It also doesn't include government agencies who are generally excluded from a lot of these laws. As far as like the requirements, there's 3 kind of top line requirements, and I'll provide a little bit more specifics after I provide an overview of the 3. The first is that you have to adopt a retail workplace violence prevention policy. The second is that you have to develop and implement a workplace violence prevention training. And then the third is for certain retail employers of a certain size, you have to install a silent response button. It was previously referred to as a panic button, but in recent amendments, they changed it to a silent response button. So let me walk through those in a little bit more detail. As far as the policy, it's pretty straightforward. Each covered employer has to adopt a retail policy, workplace violence prevention policy. Included in the policy, you'll want to include like factors or situations that make retail employees at risk at the workplace. So think about working late at night or early in the morning, exchanging money with the public, working alone or in small numbers, or uncontrolled access to the workplace. You want to like make it clear to your retail employees what are some risk factors they should be aware of as far as working in a retail store. Then the company was going to want to highlight some of the things they've put in place aimed at preventing incidents of workplace violence. And they specifically make reference to establishing and implementing a reporting system for incidents of workplace violence. So you'll also want to do that. In the policy, you'll also want to include references to federal, state, and local laws about violence against retail workers, and importantly, remedies available to victims of retail violence. And so you'll want to highlight those. And then the last major requirement is a clear statement that retaliation against individuals who complain of workplace violence or the risk factors will not be, that the company does not tolerate retaliation against those individuals. You'll want to provide this policy to all employees upon hire. And then every time you do a workplace violence training, you'll also want to provide them a copy of this policy. It has to be available in English and the language identified by the employee as their primary language. So that's the policy. Let me pause there. Melanie, any questions about that? Or
So many. Give me a +1 in the comments if you're hearing this and feeling overwhelmed. Like, holy cow, how are we supposed to meet all these needs? Is it just me? Okay, it might just be me. I'm not seeing anybody else in the comments give a +1. My question to you, Brand, is because as I was going through this and you were explaining to me, hey, let's talk about the difference between a retail employee and other employees. I'm curious to know, let's say a company has both retail employees and corporate employees. So I used to work for a fashion company, and there was corporate and there was the floor. Who has to take the training? So not just which companies does this apply to, but do corporate people have to take the training? Do corporate people who sometimes visit the floor have to take the training? Who all does this actually apply to in terms of not the company, but the employees that need to take this training?
Yes. Do you first? I can get into more details about the training, or I guess let me answer that question, because for both the policy and the training, it really is specific to retail employees. So if you're a company that has both corporate employees and retail, all of the language in the law specifically says you need to provide the policy to retail employees and you need to provide the training to retail employees. I will say that there's a lot of different models, and sometimes corporate employees might cycle through or work within the store, otherwise visit the store. I think if you have people who are going to be in the retail environment, it's probably in your best interest to make the training available. But the actual language of the law is really specific to retail employees. And getting back to training, because I mentioned what has to be covered in the policy, but as far as training, just to highlight a few things, you have to develop a training. It has to be interactive. There's a number of specific things it has to cover. I won't get into all of them, but it has to be de-escalation tactics, active shooter drills, emergency procedures, security alarms. You'll also need to cover manager responsibilities, because managers have unique responsibilities in a retail environment. So you'll want to make specific parts of the training cater to them and their unique responsibilities, as well as a site-specific list of emergency exits and meeting places. I want to emphasize that because I think that's a really important component in the training, is making sure that people are aware of emergency procedures, how they can get out and how they can exit the premises. You have to provide that training to all employees upon hire. And if you have 50 or more retail employees, you have to provide it annually. And if you have less than 50 retail employees in the state, then you have to provide it every 2 years upon hire, and then every 2 years.
Got it. Okay. For everyone who's listening in, first of all, we're recording this session. Second of all, we'll also be sending a summary with resources afterwards. So don't worry about having to memorize every piece here. We got a question from the audience. Just to clarify, does this include hospitality workers, such as those working in a restaurant or a kitchen?
So retail workers is not a place that you go where you consume food on the premises. So someone if you have a restaurant, that's not something that's specifically included. This is specifically tailored toward retail workers. And so a restaurant is not a place where you would have to provide this training.
Lovely. And this is, for the record, specific to New York, New York State, New York City.
New York State. This is a New York State law.
Lovely. Okay. So let's dig into some of the specifics. You talked about hotline, policy, and training. On the training side, because I'm going to work
Oh,
backwards.
so not hotline. It was policy. It was policy training, and then the last requirement was the silent response button for employers with 500 or more retail employees in the state. You have to install a silent response button. This is actually like a new thing that was just amended in February, and essentially that means like it used to have a panic button. A panic button was something that could call 911 and dispatch local law enforcement, but the law was updated because a lot of feedback was that it was like very burdensome to companies to like make that available. So now you have to have a silent response button, which is something that employees can press to request immediate assistance from a security officer, a manager, or a supervisor in case of emergency.
Interesting. Okay, that's really helpful to understand what a silent response button is. I'm curious to know in the comments, just give me a yes, no, and I'll keep chatting while you all put in your answers. I'm curious to know if you all already know, if your companies already have this in place. If you know, yes, no, if they have this in place, because I'm curious to see just like how many people or companies are going to have to figure out next steps to get this set up, especially if you're quite large and have many stores, fronts that you're going to have to set this up in. Okay.
And one thing just to jump in on that, Melanie, because I think with technology, this is actually something that I think is like more straightforward to incorporate, because when I think of I was many years ago worked in the Gap, and I would think of like a response button is like right by the register, a button that I could push that would alert someone. But like now you have like, it can be a mobile, it can be like a mobile device, it can be a wearable, it can also be like a generally accessible silent response button. And so there's like more ways to actually like accomplish this. And I think moving from the panic button to a silent response button made it so that it was more accessible to a lot of retail companies to be able to provide this.
Fascinating. Okay, super helpful. So let's then talk about the other two pieces, and then we'll talk about effective dates and all of that so that people know, at what point they need to get everything set up. So on the training front, you mentioned quite a few things that this training has to include. It has to be interactive. It has to talk about various things. I'm not going to try and summarize here. I'm curious to know, that sounds like a pretty meaty training. Are there time limitations on this? How will people know if the training they're putting together is compliant? Can people build it in-house? Do they need to go externally? Like, what do people need to know about this training?
So within the law for both the policy and the training, the New York Department of Labor is actually required to put out a model policy and a model training. It's unclear right now. They've not made it available, even though the law was supposed to go into effect actually today or yesterday, depending on your calculation. They've not made it available. So it's unclear like what they're going to eventually release, but that is a mandate that will be available. And so it'll lay out some of those. But I think a lot of times like documents like those are really starting points. Like it's great because it helps you meet like the minimum requirements of the law. So definitely like look out to the New York Department of Labor website to see that. But there is kind of like the minimum for something like workplace violence. I know a lot of times the new law comes out and people say like, I just want to check the box. This is such a distraction from my core work. But with workplace violence, it's like a very serious thing. And I feel like companies like want to make sure that you're investing the time. And so you can take those, or you can, Ethena, shameless plug, Ethena has a training that we've spent a lot of time developing. And we've really tried to make it interactive because I think it's really important that your retail employees walk away understanding the things that are required to be covered in the law, because they're really essential, like de-escalation tactics, how to protect themselves from workplace violence. Just like reading something on a page is probably not going to be enough for people to really understand. And so making sure it's something that really resonates with your retail workers is important.
When you say interactive, what exactly do you mean? Does this have to be a live training? Can it be a virtual training? Like, how do you make it interactive?
So they haven't said, I mean, a lot of times interactive can be in a lot of different forums. I just think they don't want like you to print I don't want to speak because there's a lot of more direction that's going to come up from the New York Department of Labor. But generally, like you can have an online training that makes it doesn't necessarily require like an in-person training. At least like that's how in the harassment prevention space, when interactive trainings are required under like New York or California law, it can generally be delivered through a number of forums as long as the person is otherwise engaged in interacting with it.
Got it. Okay, super helpful. So let's talk effective dates, because you said tell me more.
Yeah, so I think when we first picked this date, it was because the law was supposed to go into effect again, if you calculate either March 3rd or March 4th. In February, there was an amendment passed that pushed the dates of certain aspects of the law to June 2nd of 2025. And so like the requirement to have a policy in place and to have training done is now June 2nd of 2025. There is a second compliance deadline for that silent response button. That's January of 2027, but that didn't change with the amendment. And so now the requirements, like the first batch of requirements for this law, come into effect on June 2nd, 2025.
Got it. Okay, helpful. So we got a question in the comments. I'm curious to dig into this one too. I a little while back, like not too long ago, California also rolled out a workplace violence prevention law. Now New York is coming in. I'm curious to know, is this part of a broader trend? Should companies start anticipating that this will be rolled out nationwide eventually? Should they be proactively assigning these trainings to everyone at their company versus just doing it in states where it is legally required?
So I want to like first set the stage. Like workplace violence prevention is not something that's new. Like there's been a lot of legislation in the healthcare space because the like prevalence of workplace violence was relatively high with respect to healthcare. And so a lot of states previously had requirements related to certain trainings or requirements for like various healthcare locations. California was really, I think, the first state that really decided to make a general requirement that you had to provide training, like not industry specific, which I think just like was a shift because the incidence of workplace violence was not limited to like a certain number of like sub industries now, and it was starting to affect a lot of other parts of our economy. And so I think California just really wanted more people to receive training on it, and then New York quickly followed suit, recognizing some of the unique challenges associated with retail workers. I would expect to see like other states follow suit. I think Minnesota currently has a law that's pending that is for retail workers. I generally like California and New York are some of the first movers, and then there's other states that tend to follow suit depending on like specifically what's happening. So I think I think when you go through the process of putting in place your workplace violence prevention policy, like doing the risk assessment and trying to understand where the potential for workplace violence is a really important component. And maybe not just like looking just within retail workers, but where there might be potentials for workplace violence elsewhere. And then thinking about providing access to information and training to those employees as well. I think, I feel like everyone on this call is really interested in protecting their employees. And so education is always a good way to make people understand like what risk factors they should be aware of, how to de-escalate a violent incident, whether that be with like a customer or a coworker, and then taking action to protect themselves. So
Yeah.
I would expect to see this other places, and I know that there's also some state AGs that have started like focusing, looking at this, and so I would expect more on that front as well.
Yeah, I mean, what is always fascinating to me with, any acts that come out, understanding that there have always been laws in general around this is they really do force us, I think rightly so, to really think about things that we should have been thinking about all along anyway, right? What plan do you have in place if something happens? Do your employees have clarity around retaliation, your retaliation policies and the law and how to, speak up, protect themselves, so on and so forth. And so I really like that this is going to sort of have everyone just take a second look, really think through their policies and make sure that they've got a robust process in place because law or no law, you still want to be protecting your workers and you want to be protecting the company by making sure that you have a good process in place to mitigate risk. So here's what I'm wondering, as we sort of go deeper into this. You mentioned a lot of needs that this policy in particular needs to cover. How can employers set themselves up for success in making sure that they are complying with these requirements?
Yeah, so I think there's like probably like 5 things that come top of mind. What first is like start early. I know that a lot of people celebrated the date being pushed back to June, in part because they needed to get compliant. But I would encourage companies not to wait until June 1st to try to get all your ducks in a row, because you really want to make sure that you're like being thoughtful about any policy that you put in place. Assemble like a team, a cross-functional team of different people to get different perspectives of like potential workplace violence, and like conduct a thorough like assessment of like workplace risks specific to your retail location, because the law gives some suggestions, but depending on where your retail store is located or the things around it, there might be things that are unique to your company, and you want to make sure that you're not just like copying and pasting what you see, but really being intentional about what's covered there. You'll want to like just like document, like as you're like learning things, like as you're learning risks, like keep track of them, like make sure that you're addressing them effectively. Training. So I think again, I want to just like emphasize that I'm certain that like providing another training to employees, especially in retail locations, can seem like it's a pretty big burden. But again, with the rising incidence of workplace violence, I think like having your employees like take a really engaging and thoughtful training that like addresses the types of issues that are kind of core to this law is important. And you want to make sure that it's something they're going to walk away with like tangible like skills on de-escalation, how to handle an active shooter. And then you just really want to make sure you track completion, because it's really important that you have like a clear record of who was trained and when they were trained to meet the law. Last 2 things, so like creating feedback channels. We didn't really get into a hotline. While a hotline is not expressly required under the workplace violence prevention policy, you do have to like have essentially like reporting channels that are available. And so I think, reporting can go to a manager, could go to HR if you have an HR in your retail store available, but having anonymous like reporting channels is really key, because a lot of times you don't know what are threats of workplace violence, and your employees might not feel comfortable speaking to a manager or to some of their other coworkers. So making sure you have like a way for people to share that information is really important. And then lastly, just like stay informed. New York's going to come out with some model policy and templates. There's going to be like some developments. Just like if you want to stay up to date, just like keep tracking it, maybe set an alert just to make sure that if anything changes about the law.
Yeah, I think your point on the hotline is a really important one. And I'd actually love to dig into this a little bit, because I remember way back when I interned at Coach, the handbag company, and I worked there for a couple of summers. And I remember one of the sales reps actually shared a story where one of their stores just could not meet goal, like they could not hit their sales goals, and they couldn't figure out why. And so finally, the exec just went into the store, didn't tell anyone, was just walking around and started like talking to the people who worked there. And lo and behold, he found out that the reason why they couldn't hit their sales goals and why they couldn't retain anyone at the company to work was because the store closed after the last buses were running. And so people didn't have a way to get home. They didn't feel safe walking back home in that area at night. And so it was this issue that no one in corporate would have been made aware of if they didn't have an outlet, which at that point sounds like they did not have an outlet for people to speak up. And I just always think about like you can, especially in that environment where you're so separated from corporate, you could talk to your floor manager, about whatever, but it doesn't mean necessarily that your floor manager knows who to escalate that to, or that there's even an option to speak up about this. And so I think about, potential, things that could make someone feel unsafe, potential things that are happening at your stores that you might not be aware of. And if you don't have some sort of hotline or outlet for all employees to go to, and not just directing them to an in-person manager, you might miss out on something really important. Are there any other things that you think are worth exploring here, Brandis, before we dig into some of the resources that Ethena can provide to you, both free and not, just so that you all feel like you've got, something, a starting point here?
Nope, I think I covered it. I'll just like kind of highlight again the requirements being the policy, the training, and then for like retail employers with 500 or more employees within New York, they also have to have the silent response button. Just like make sure, continue to track, because as I mentioned, there was an amendment in February that kind of changed some of these requirements. And I don't anticipate another amendment before the effective date, but like who knows what could happen. And so just like staying up to date is really important. We'll do our best to continue to educate anyone and any of our listservs if there's any changes that they should be aware of.
Lovely. Okay. And I'm actually seeing that Whitney in the comments asked a question I want to make sure we get to, which is, does this apply to employees in a plant, warehouse, etc.?
So again, like the language is very specific, and I'm like just like pulling up retail employee. I'm like looking at the language is an employee working at a retail store for an employer. So that to me would suggest if it's just like a plant that's offsite, that's not something that's like specifically covered. There could be like further clarification. There could also be other laws that are applicable. So I don't want to say just because this law might not cover it doesn't mean that there might not be other like requirements or OSHA requirements as to what you have to do with respect to workplace safety. But this law is specifically aimed at retail employees.
Lovely. Okay, awesome. So here's what I'm going to do all. I promised you that we would, one, send you follow-up resources that you can lean on, and two, that I would show you some of those now so that you can make sure that you check them out and see if they're relevant to you and all that stuff. So I'm going to share one thing with you first off, which is I want to share that we have a template prevention policy, or sorry, a template retail workplace violence prevention policy already in place for you that you can literally just copy and paste and then adjust to include your company's name. And this will keep you compliant and make sure that you've covered all your bases with the various needs that Brandis mentioned. Obviously, feel free to customize it to your company's needs, change the language so it feels more you, whatever it is, put in your logo. But this will make sure that you're covered, and it's got, very clear instructions at the top. So very easy to use. Again, this is free, and we'll share this with everybody after the call. I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to actually switch over now to the training. So if you're on the HR side, like me, which I imagine most of us are on this call, you know that one of the biggest complaints that people get on the HR side is the time that training can take from workers, because especially if you've got hourly retail workers, every hour that they're taking a training is an hour that you're paying, an hour that they're not on the floor. And understandably, while this training is very, very important, you're also trying to manage your overall business needs and the workload. And so with that, I actually want to very briefly just screen share with you the training that we've put in place that meets the requirements. And you may be surprised to know that we have actually managed to squeeze everything into just 5 minutes. I don't know if you can see this. I'll try and make it a little bit bigger. So this is our New York retail workplace violence prevention training. It meets the requirements. As you can see, this is the full list of topics that it covers. De-escalation is Brandis mentioned, active shooter incidents, and then we do checks on learnings to make sure that you are compliant with the interactive requirements here. So they are actually processing the information and answering questions. And you can also track on our platform, how people responded, like what the percentages are, and any additional training that you may want to follow up with or clarity that you want to provide. It's a mix of media. So we've got some videos, some text content, but again, our goal was to keep this as brief as possible. And employees are able to also sign attestations. So if you want to embed your policy within this, you can do that and then have employees sign or acknowledge that they've read the policy. And that way you've gotten everything knocked out in one go. Again, our goal is to make this as low lift as possible for you all, because we understand you have a million things on your plate, and we're not trying to make this more complicated than it needs to be, while covering, this very important topic. We also have a full suite of violence prevention training. So if you want to make it more robust, if you want it to be a 15-minute training, whatever, you can add training content. And for anyone who is wondering, well, maybe I have retail workers, but they don't have an email. How am I supposed to get this training? How am I supposed to get them this training? Brandis Brandis said, it's supposed to happen upon hire and then annually thereafter. How do you do that with a platform? Our platform actually allows people to just take their training through a link that you share with people, and then it allows you to track completion rates. So very easy, very low lift, and you're able to sort of document everything so that if you ever got audited, you would be completely covered. You have a full record of training completion rates. You know who you need to follow up with, send reminders to, all of that. So again, we fully are able to meet the needs of retail and corporate workers if you did decide that you wanted to extend this training to your corporate employees as well. Okay, I'm seeing something in the chat. Let me just make sure I didn't miss it. Okay, will we receive SHRM? Yes, let me screen share that for you all in a hot second. Let me change here. So for anyone who was dialed in, who was tuning in and hoping to get SHRM credits, I'm going to put that up for you right now. Give me 1 second. Here you go. And then Ace, if you have any poll questions that you want to put in for the audience, go ahead and do that now while people are collecting their SHRM information. Give me 1 second to pull up the right screen. Hang on. So sorry, y'all. Here you go. Okay, with that said, please take a couple of seconds just to answer these questions for us. We find it really valuable to get this data so that we can better help you and provide the necessary resources that will be relevant to you. And then if you have any other questions, please drop them in the Q&A. It looks like we've got one new one. Oh no, okay, that was already answered. Yeah, any other questions here? If not, we are so very happy to give you back time in your day. We said we would try and make this speedy, and we meant it. Okay, all. With that said, I just want to wish everyone a very happy Tuesday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please keep an eye out for that email. We're going to send you a copy of the policy template, as well as a link to sample the training in case anyone's curious. We wish you all the best. If we could go into your stores and put up that silent response button for you, we'd do it too, but that's the one thing we can't do for you. So we're going to help with everything else. All right, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.